This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 272. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is Advanced ZFS Dataset Management, Snapshots, Clones, and Bookmarks.
Yeah, one of the most common misunderstandings with ZFS is just how snapshots actually work and what clones are, but an especially big one is bookmarks. People are not clear what they're for or how they can help, and so in this article, I break down the details of how snapshots actually work on the inside and how you can take advantage of bookmarks.
Hopefully next year, 20 people will know how bookmarks work instead of only 5.
All right, and you've got a bonus plug for a webinar.
Yep. In November, we'll be doing ZFS Mastery, the bits they don't put in the man pages. So that'll be Michael Lucas and I on November 19th, Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. So if you want to get some tips on, hardware lessons from running ZFS in production and tuning advice and operational practices that will help you out, and just kind of how the thinking in ZFS has evolved across time, come check out our webinar.
Right, well, links in the show notes as usual. Pat Reagan recently put up an interesting post asking the question, do refurbished hard disks make sense for your home NAS server?
And I don't think that we can really go into all the details that Pat went through here on the show. There's just too much of it. It all looks pretty good. The conclusion he comes down to is, yeah, you should probably do that. The short version of this is that, are refurbished drives potentially less trustworthy than brand new drives? Sure, potentially. On the other hand, you're talking about building a NAS. You're building in redundancy. You're making sure that you've got backup. You're doing all the things. You're prepared for drives to fail unexpectedly. So it's really not a question of, will these drives fail? Because if so, that's a very bad day for me. It's a question of whether these drives are going to fail so much more frequently and so much earlier that it creates a problem for me that drives failing in general would not have.
You have to assume that all your drives are going to fail anyway. And so if the cost per terabyte is that much better on drives that might not last quite as long, but if the dollars per terabyte year is better, that's probably still the better plan for you. Plus, if that saves you some money now, it means you can upgrade to bigger drives later. It can make a big difference. The other one that he talks about here, obviously, is one of the places that they're sourcing drives from is Server Part Deals, and they have 2 different kinds of drives. You can get refurbished drives, but they also offer recertified drives, which are still brand new. So these are drives that failed something in QA at the manufacturer, and the manufacturer fixed them and is selling them to you, and they are still 0 hours power on time, unlike a refurbished drive. They will be kind of a middle cost between the two, but depending on your use case, that can also still be a sweet spot, especially compared to buying brand new drives, especially right now when brand new drives are getting harder to come by as well.
If you're just looking for, the short version, the recommendation, okay, well, what does Alan do? What does Jim do? Well, Jim pretty much always buys refurbished Rust drives because the bang for the buck is just far, far better. In my personal experience, I haven't really had any bad experiences with refurbs. Have I had some refurbs fail? Absolutely. Have I had some fail in the first year? Absolutely. But the same thing is true of brand new drives. I would imagine that if I sat down and I tried to actually inventory every single drive I deployed, new versus refurbished, I would probably be able to identify, getting maybe a year less on average out of refurbs. But if I only get 1 year less on drives that I typically go for 7 to 8 years on, and I pay 2/3 the price, sometimes half the price, well, that's just a better deal.
Yeah. Pat also points out some things to look for as far as the age of the drives you're buying. Obviously, part of that is if you look at the model of a drive, it'll be in a generation. And for example, on Seagate drives, that generation is named after the biggest drive of that generation. So if you see like an X22, that's from the series of drives where 22 terabytes was the biggest drive. If you're buying a smaller drive from that series, it might actually be newer than a drive from an older series that was the same size, but you're getting 3 or 4 years newer drive because it's on a newer generation.
But then if you get a 16 terabyte drive, you know that it can't necessarily be older than a certain period when they didn't make them.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And conversely, if you go and buy a 2 terabyte Rust drive, well, guess what? That thing is very old because they haven't made those for a while now.
Pat brought up a great point that was, look at the warranties that are available. If they're only going to give you a year, then maybe it's more likely to die sooner than if they're willing to give you a 3-year warranty.
Right. And there are some drives that they only offer like 90 days, protection that it won't be dead when you receive it, and that's it. And that can be a big signal on how much confidence the site has in the drive.
Generally speaking, when a site is offering refurbished or recertified drives and giving you at least a year's worth of warranty on it, I don't think those drives really need any more particular care put into evaluating them than you would a brand new drive. But if you've only got, 90 days to return it if something's wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean that those drives are going to be crappy. But that does mean that, okay, now if you're going to try those, I hope you're getting a really, really amazingly good deal, because with a warranty period that short, you are really going to need to actually sit down and look at each one of those drives you bought before you actually try to put it in production. If they're only warranting it for 90 days, you're going to need to look at how many power on hours it's had. More importantly, how many power on events it's had, because power cycling produces the most wear and tear on a mechanical drive. So if you see something has been powered, on and off several hundred times, and you bought it with only a 90-day warranty, you need to send that back immediately. Don't wait for it to fail. Send it back now. On the other hand, if you've got a year, 3 years, whatever, roll the dice. See how it goes.
I've got a question for you, and I think I know what the answer is going to be. If I came to you and said, should I buy this USB hard drive and shuck it, or should I buy this refurbished drive, which one should I go for?
Refurb.
The only thing you should do with USB drives is throw them at people. That's all they're good for. Some of this made me look at my own drives and realize that one of the old Scale Engine servers has mostly 6 terabyte drives that were manufactured in the year 2016 and have been 24/7 for almost 10 years now and are still working. And that is not something we would have seen so much in the past. Drives tended to die a lot sooner than that. These were high-end HGST helium drives, so sometimes the great drive was there and then some other company bought them and now they don't make good drives anymore.
Western Digital.
Well, there was an interesting post from Backblaze. Are hard drives getting better? Let's revisit the bathtub curve.
Yeah, so they were looking at stats over an even longer period now that they've had them for quite a while. And we're seeing some pretty interesting results. Especially back in their 2013 data, they had some really high failure rates, up to like 12 and 14%. But to remind people, that was when there was the shortage because of the floods in Thailand. And Backblaze was doing things like buying USB hard drives and chucking them.
Also, even on their best days, please remember, Backblaze buys the cheapest thing they can find and stuffs it in a box. When you look at these rates, some of them are going to be on proper enterprise-grade storage devices, and some of them are going to be on the absolute worst garbage you could find at, a Walmart. Backblaze doesn't really differentiate. They get whatever they can get a big lot of and they dump it into some boxes. They do break it out in their stats so you can see the different normalized failure rates, for each model, but just be aware that everything is in there from the absolute cheapest to actually designed for purpose drives.
Well, we're talking like Barracudas and stuff.
Yes.
We're talking like models that you can't normally buy from a retailer because they're only for OEMs or for inside USB enclosures and stuff.
Right.
Like specialty drives and the lowest end stuff, whatever they could buy by the container load.
It is absolutely the Joe purchase plan.
How dare you? Also, yes, I have some Barracudas.
Well, Barracudas aren't that bad, but...
Yes, they are. I'm going to overrule Alan here. Barracudas are desktop grade. They are garbage. Please don't use those.
But over time, they've matured to being mostly, I think, because as they needed to buy larger and larger volumes, it became only possible to get enterprise drives at the volumes they needed. And they've seen, much better performance over time now. Looking at their data. They're seeing, some drives that are up to 10 years old now and have been running well. And the failure rates looking a lot more in the 2-ish% plus or minus 1 or so. That is what drive manufacturers claim the drives will be. The curve is not necessarily looking like a bathtub so much as a pretty straightforward, constant rate of failure. Not seeing as much of the big spike at the beginning when drives are new. And that partly, I think, is better testing at the manufacturers. And that, gets back to our conversations about recertified drives. And then eventually you do get the deaths as they get really old. But even then, this is a drive that has survived a 2% chance to failure every day for 10 years. It's not necessarily going to suddenly have a spike. It's just the population will be quite diminished by then.
And also it's more of a long tail than it used to be.
Right. Well, and also if you think about the past, a drive that was that old would have been so small as to not be useful. And that's less the case nowadays. Like if you think back to 2010 and a drive that was 10 years old would be like single-digit gigabytes.
I do suspect also that a lot of the differences that we're seeing in between the 2013 results and the 2021 results from Backblaze is, as Alan mentioned, the pattern of drives they bought has changed dramatically over time. And I suspect that the much better looking curve that we see now that only really shows the failure rates doubling at about the 6-year mark instead of the 3-year mark and not having a huge initial spike, I don't think that's because we're making better hard drives these days, so much as that Backblaze is buying fewer, you never should have bought those and you should have known it, hard drives. When you buy a crate load of actual designed for purpose NAS drives or enterprise storage drives, these are about the rates that I was expecting to see in 2013, not just 2021. Tying things back to our earlier question about the refurbished drives, whichever way you look at it, I think this is a pretty good indication that, yes, buying refurbished drives should make sense. Because when we're looking at failure rates that don't climb even up past the 10% rate until about 6 years in, well, again, if you lose a year or two off the expected lifespan of the drive, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Backblaze doesn't actually necessarily track every single hard drive until its death date. If a drive survives until it's too small for them to use anymore, it's not really going to show up on these graphs. So we don't really see anything about when can we expect most drives to be dead in Backblaze's failure numbers. What we really see is when can you expect them to start dying. And I don't have a site for you if you're looking for, an idea of like when should I be surprised if a drive is still working right? But in my experience, again, if you're buying designed for purpose storage systems, not just the cheapest crap that you could, throw in your mom's computer, I typically expect drives to last more than 10 years on average, functioning quite well. Do they start dying, earlier than that? Yes, absolutely. But in general, would I expect most of the drives in an array that I built for purpose now to still be working 10 years from now? Yes, I would.
Jim, you recently had an M.2 NVMe drive die in the middle of a presentation about storage.
I did. I was at All Things Open this year in Raleigh. Greatly recommend that conference, by the way. Largest open source technical conference on the East Coast and well worth the trip. My talk was on storage fundamentals, and one of the things that I hammered on in that talk, because it's something that I see people getting wrong so frequently, is this idea that we always want to rush to consumer M.2 NVMe drives for everything because they're super, super fast. Why would we want this old busted, SATA or SAS stuff? And in fact, there are a lot of bottlenecks that NVMe does not fix. And the specifications on the drive that tell you how amazingly super duper fast it is, well, that's kind of like, the speedometer that goes all the way to 160 on a, Ford Festiva. Like, just because the speedometer goes to 160 doesn't mean you're going to go that fast unless you drive it off a cliff. And it's kind of the same thing with storage, especially consumer devices. But the other thing that I mentioned was that consumer M.2 drives are notorious for thermal issues. They overheat, and that can cause performance problems, or it can cause the entire drive to just grenade itself. And about 5 minutes after I went through that segment of my talk, the cheap consumer M.2 drive in my laptop died.
Although it didn't actually die, right? Because later on that night in the hotel room, you turned it back on and it was working fine. So it just overheated, shit the bed, and then came back to life later.
Well, I think most people would say it died if it was non-responsive. There was no pulse for like 20 hours. It's dead.
Fair enough.
Maybe it came back out of the cave 3 days later, but it still died, Joe.
So you don't trust it now, presumably?
No, well, yes and no. I never trusted it. People thought that was a much more stressful situation for me than it really was. The fact of the matter is I use budget laptops for presentations, and I go to conferences with a pair of them in my backpack just in case one dies. Now, in this particular case, it didn't do me any good because my other laptop was a framework that died on me that morning before I ever got to the conference. So this was my backup laptop. Inexpensive Acer Swift 3 with a cheap OEM Samsung M.2 drive. And yeah, the drive overheated. It became responsive again the next morning when I tried booting the laptop just for giggles, which doesn't change the fact that the whole operating system crashed. And when it tried to boot back up, I actually finished the last, 18 minutes or so of my talk with infinitely scrolling ext4 general recovery aborted error messages on the screen behind me. This wasn't actually all that stressful for me. It was definitely okay, we need to stop and, take stock of things and figure out a game plan. But honestly, I'm glad it happened. A lot of people thought that it was a gimmick, that, it was just a really slick transition to video. And any minute now I was going to hit the space bar and my real laptop was going to come back. No, it really died on stage in the middle of my talk. And I finished the rest of my talk with no slides, no deck, just off of memory. And it went well. But that's the thing. If you're prepared for things to break, then when they do break, it's not so bad.
Yeah, and this doesn't happen only to consumer drives. I've helped a customer that had relatively high-end Dell servers with the Boss M.2 controller card that you put a mirrored pair of NVMe drives on for your boot drives, so they don't take up slots that you would normally use for, a larger storage pool or something. And they were having issues where those drives were getting too hot. They were kind of running at like 75 degrees Celsius, which is not, it breaks, but it was not good for it considering the drives were not under a lot of load. And they would start getting suspicious resets and the drive just taking a long time to do stuff and then, disappearing and reappearing all the time and causing ZFS to do little mini scrubs to catch up the drive for what it had missed while it was off out to lunch because it was too hot. And it's like, yeah, probably those particular M.2 drives really needed a heatsink to be in a server chassis in a data center. Gum sticks were not a good idea for computer parts.
No, especially not storage. Storage, for crying out loud. What is the one thing in your computer that you least want to die? The storage.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Alexander has done. When I built my first all-purpose NAS/VM host server, I went with all spinning Rust drives. As such, I partitioned all the drives within EFI boot partition, even though only one would be used at a time, swap, and main ZFS partitions. For my next server, I'm including SSDs in the mix. Should I continue to make each drive bootable, or could I dedicate a single SSD for boot and OS duty? Am I overthinking things? I've heard, for instance, that ZFS should be given whole drives instead of partitions.
Okay, so first up, you can't really give ZFS a whole drive. I mean, you can tell it, here's a whole drive for you, but then it just immediately partitions it. So you really shouldn't get too worked up about that. The nice thing about letting ZFS partition the drive for itself is that you know that the partitions will wind up on sector-aligned boundaries. On the other hand, you really, really have to work hard to create a non-aligned partition these days. All the file system tools automatically try really hard to force you to create partitions on the correct boundaries, so it's not really something you can accidentally do wrong. For the EFI boot partitions, it gets a little bit more complicated. If you're booting directly from ZFS, then yeah, I would absolutely make every drive bootable. I can't really come up with a whole lot of reason not to do that. On the other hand, if you're doing a separate pool from your operating system's root file system, then you probably don't really want to do a root and boot on every single drive. I would still recommend doing it on at least 2. I generally like to set up an MD RAID 1 and I boot and do RAID off of the MD RAID 1. That might be either 2 drives or 4, depending on how paranoid I'm feeling. But in general, on my systems, which again are hybrid, I have an ext4 root and all the stuff I really cares about goes in a ZFS pool. There's not really a whole lot of action happening on the root file system. It trickles log files down there. Sure, it might, grab some stuff. The host will grab a library from there when it needs to, but for the most part, it's going to get everything it needs from that root file system when it boots, and it's not going to touch it a whole lot after that. So there's not really a big downside to having a less than ideally efficient topology for your root file system, like that MD RAID 1 mirror, even across like 4 drives. Is that more redundancy than you need? Yes. Is it a lot of space? Probably not in modern terms, with multiple terabyte drives. And just the peace of mind it gives you is worth it.
Yeah, so the partition thing is an old thing from Solaris, where if you opened a whole drive, you got the full bandwidth, but if you opened a partition, then the OS would disable a number of features because you couldn't work them on only a fraction of the drive. So if you're on Linux or FreeBSD, partitions will have no detrimental effect at all to using ZFS. So you're fine to, as Jim said, either let ZFS do the partitioning or do it yourself if you want to be more specific. All the stuff you've heard about ZFS needing the whole drive and not just a partition is specific to Solaris and hasn't really applied to OpenZFS ever. There are some advantages to doing, especially not just EFI, but maybe swap on every drive, is it gives you that little bit of extra wiggle room if a replacement drive isn't the same size as the original drive. But the downside to doing all this partitioning is you have to replicate that partitioning on a replacement drive when you go to swap it in if you want it to be identical. Depending on what operating system you're using, it can be a little bit of a faff to actually clone the partition table from one drive to another drive. So it doesn't make a big difference, but as Jim said, if your OS is going to be separate, either its own zpool or a non-ZFS file system for the root, then it probably makes sense to just put all the boot stuff over there and not replicate it to every drive. But it really depends on your situation, but you can't really make it bad going any of these different directions.
I would advise against swap on every single drive, because the problem with swap on a drive is that's a single point of failure.
You do not have to use the swap partition, but you can have one on every drive. I should have been more clear on that.
Yep, you can create a small partition. I would not attempt to actually activate swap on every single drive, because if you do that, what you have done is you have destroyed your guarantees, against downtime. Because if you lose any drive, you lose the swap on that drive, and that can very easily cause a kernel panic or other greatly undesired system behaviors that you do not want to experience. So please do not try to activate a swap partition on every single drive in a NAS or other server with a whole bunch of drives in it. If you do, you're going to have a bad time.
I don't know how it goes on Linux. On FreeBSD, it's much more typical to mirror the swap across a couple of drives at a time so that, again, if a drive fails, even if it's the only drive that had swap, you would still have the problem of uptime. Whereas if you mirror your swap, then you lose one drive and you can still swap that data back in and not have the situation where this program can't move because a chunk of its memory was on a disk that's not there anymore. Because that can really screw you over in really interesting ways.
Well, on Linux, if you just add a swap partition on every drive and let it do what it's going to do, most distributions will activate all of them. Mm-hmm. And you will have, if you've got 8 drives, each of the swap partition, you'll wind up with 8 separate swap volumes. And the system will basically just use whichever one feels the handiest to it at any given time. And like I said, if you lose one, then you're going to have system instability. Now, mirroring swap is absolutely also a thing you can do. That is something that I would recommend doing. If you're actually going to use swap and depend on it, get yourself some redundancy, put it beneath a simple RAID layer. You don't want RAID 5. You don't want RAID 6. RAID 10, maybe if you're doing it across enough drives, but in general, you really don't want to use swap much, even if you've got it. So it's not typically something that you want to litter across every drive you've got.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenariesysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.